The first one was a blue chicory. I know this because I looked it up. I'm not someone who knows wildflowers by name. I'm a 32-year-old civil engineer in Asheville, North Carolina, and my professional relationship with the natural world is structural rather than botanical. But when I found a small bunch of blue chicory on my porch railing on a Tuesday morning in May, tied with a piece of twine, no note, no card, nothing, I took a photograph of it, and I looked it up, and I stood there in my doorway holding my coffee and thinking, someone left this here on purpose. Not by accident, not as a misdirected delivery. The twine was too deliberate. The placement, centered on the railing post, visible from the door, was too considered. Someone had come to my porch before I was awake and left a small bunch of blue chicory and then gone without knocking, without leaving a name, without any explanation at all. I went to work. I thought about it all day. The second one appeared Thursday morning, a different flower, yellow wood sorrel, which I also had to look up, and which turned out to be technically a weed, but which, tied in a small bunch with the same twine on the same railing post, was unambiguously intentional. I looked at my porch camera. I had a camera, the kind that records motion, and I found 18 seconds of footage from 5:47 in the morning. A figure in the early light, moving quickly. The camera angle caught nothing useful except the fact that they were there. I stood on my porch with a bunch of yellow wood sorrel in my hand on a Thursday morning in May and thought, this is either the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me or the beginning of something I should be concerned about. I decided to be interested rather than concerned. I don't know if that was wise. It turned out to be exactly right. Before I go further, I need to tell you something. I live alone in a house on the north side of Asheville that belonged to my grandfather and came to me when he died 3 years ago. It is a craftsman-style house with a deep front porch that runs the full width of the structure, the kind of porch that was built when porches meant something, when people actually sat on them in the evenings and talked to the neighbors who walked past. I had been in the house for 2 years, and I had sat on that porch approximately 12 times. The porch was beautiful, and I was neglecting it, and somehow it took a series of wildflowers to make me understand that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The flowers kept coming, not every day, every Tuesday and Thursday, regular as a calendar, each one different, each one tied with the same natural twine, centered on the same railing post. The third was purple clover. The fourth was Queen Anne's lace, which I had always known by sight, but not by name. The fifth was something called heel-all, which is a tiny violet wildflower that apparently grows in disturbed ground and which I found, when I looked it up, had been used in traditional medicine for centuries. The sixth was goldenrod. I started keeping them. This surprised me. I am not a person who keeps flowers. I don't own a vase, or didn't own one until the third week of the mystery, when I bought a simple glass jar from a hardware store specifically for the purpose. Each Tuesday and Thursday, I would find a new bunch on the railing and bring it inside and add it to the jar and look up what it was and think about who was leaving it and why. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want to stop and ask you something, because this is exactly the kind of situation that divides people, and I'm genuinely curious which side you're on. If someone was leaving flowers on your porch every week without leaving a name, not anything alarming, just wildflowers, gathered and tied with care, would you try to find out who it was? Or would you let it be mysterious for as long as it lasted? Leave me your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is already doing something to you, hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything, because what I did next and what I found is the part that I still think about every morning when I open my front door. I started sitting on the porch, not to catch them, or not only for that, but because the flowers had made me aware of the porch in a way I hadn't been before, and because it was May in Asheville, which is the specific month when the mountains do the thing they do, and the air has a quality that makes staying inside feel like a small betrayal of the season. I started sitting out in the evenings with a book or a coffee, or sometimes just nothing, and I noticed things I hadn't noticed in 2 years of owning the house. I noticed my neighbor across the street, an older man named Mr. Calloway, who watered his tomato plants every evening at 7 exactly. I noticed the family 2 houses down whose children played in the front yard until the porch light came on. I noticed the specific quality of the late light through the oak tree on the left side of my yard, which was the kind of light that a photographer would arrange things to catch. And I noticed the woman. Not immediately, not the first evening or the second, but by the fourth evening I was out on the porch, I noticed that there was someone who walked the street every Tuesday and Thursday evening at approximately 8:15. I noticed this because the timing was specific, and because she always slowed when she passed my house, and because the third time she passed, she looked up and saw me sitting on the porch, and for a moment, a long enough moment to notice, she stopped walking entirely. She was maybe 29 or 30, dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was carrying something in her hand. I couldn't see what from the porch distance. And she was dressed in the way of someone who has been out in the fields or the woods, which in Asheville in May means mud on the boots and something botanical on the hands. She looked at me on my porch with the specific expression of someone who has just found something where they didn't expect it, and then she started walking again, and turned at the corner and was gone. I sat on my porch and I thought, there she is. I didn't call after her. I didn't follow her. I sat on my porch with the specific patience of someone who has decided that the right move is to be present rather than to pursue. And I thought about the 6 wildflower bunches in the glass jar on my kitchen table, and the 18 seconds of porch camera footage, and the specific quality of someone who leaves something beautiful without leaving a name. The next Tuesday, I was on the porch at 5:30 in the morning. Not to intercept, I want to be precise about this. I was on the porch at 5:30 because I had started setting my alarm for 5:30, which I had never done before, because I wanted to be present for the morning in a way the flowers had made me want to be. I had coffee. I had a blanket because May mornings in Asheville are still cold at altitude. I was sitting in the dark on my porch when the sky began to go from black to gray to the specific pale blue that comes before actual light, and I was watching it happen when I heard footsteps. She came from the north end of the street. She was walking quickly in the way of someone on a mission, head slightly down, something in her hand. She reached my gate, unlatched it without breaking stride, came up the porch steps, and was halfway to the railing post before she looked up and saw me. She stopped completely. We looked at each other for a moment that was longer than most moments. She was holding a small bunch of something. I would later learn it was wild bergamot, the seventh flower, and the early morning light was doing the thing it does in May in the mountains, which is to make everything look like it is lit from inside, and she was standing on my porch steps with wild bergamot in her hand, and the expression of someone who has been found at something they were not quite ready to be found at. She said, "I was going to leave before you were awake." I said, "I know. I set an alarm." She said, "You set an alarm?" I said, "I've been setting it for a week." She looked at the flower in her hand, then at me, then at the railing post where she had been headed. She said, "I should explain." I said, "I'd like that." She said, "Can I sit down?" I said, "That's why there are 2 chairs." She looked at the 2 chairs on the porch. I had brought out a second chair 3 days after the first evening I'd sat out, on the specific theory that 2 chairs were more inviting than one. She looked at the second chair and then at me with an expression I couldn't fully read in the early morning light, but which contained something that was not quite surprise. She sat down. She put the wild bergamot on the railing, not in its usual place, just set it down, and she tucked her hands between her knees, and she said, "Your grandfather used to let me pick wildflowers from the field behind this house." I went still. I had not expected that. She said, I grew up 2 streets over. I've been coming to that field since I was 8 years old. Your grandfather knew. He let me. He said the field grew better for the picking. She paused. He died 3 years ago. I went to his funeral, but I didn't know you. And then you moved in, and I could see from the field that the house was lived in again, and the porch was never used, and I. She stopped. I don't know. I wanted to do something for the house, for the porch, for him, maybe. I said, very carefully, so the flowers were for the porch. She looked at me. They were for whoever was living in the house. I didn't know you. I said, and now? She said, now I've been caught on your porch at 5:30 in the morning with wild bergamot in my hand. I said, that is accurate. She said, I'm Wren. I said, Patrick, it's my grandfather's house. She said, I know. He talked about you. I said, he did? She said, he said you were the kind of person who would inherit a house with a good porch and never sit on it. I stared at her. She had the expression of someone delivering a message they were entrusted with a long time ago and have been holding until the right moment. I said, that's very specific. She said, he was a very specific man. I said, he was. We were quiet for a moment. The morning was arriving around us. The birds starting up, the light going from pale blue to actual gold. The oak tree doing its thing with the new day's sun. My coffee was cold. I didn't care. I said, tell me about the flowers. She said, what do you want to know? I said, all of it. Why wildflowers? Why the twine? Why no name? She looked at her hands. Because wildflowers grow where they want to grow. They don't need anyone's permission. They're not planted, they arrive. And they're only beautiful for a short time before they go back to being seeds and ground and next year's flowers. She paused. The twine is just twine. I use it in the field. I said, and the name? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because I wasn't sure what I was doing yet, and a name makes it a thing, and I needed it to not be a thing until I understood what it was. I looked at her on my porch in the early morning light. This woman who had been leaving flowers twice a week for 6 weeks, who had known my grandfather, who had grown up 2 streets over, who had been coming to the field behind my house since she was 8 years old. I thought about blue chicory and yellow wood sorrel and purple clover and Queen Anne's lace and heel-all and goldenrod and the wild bergamot sitting on my railing now, unplaced, the first one that hadn't made it to the post. I said, what do you understand it to be now? She looked at me directly for the first time, the full version of the look, not the early morning caught at something look, but the underneath that one. She said, I think I understand it to be the beginning of something, if you want it to be. I picked up the wild bergamot from the railing. I put it in the post. I said, I want it to be. She looked at the flower on the post, then at me, then she laughed. Not the nervous version, the real one. The one that belongs to someone who has been holding something carefully for 6 weeks and has finally set it down in the right place. She said, your grandfather would be very pleased with himself right now. I said, he would be insufferable about it. She said, completely. We sat on the porch until the full morning arrived. She told me about the field, what grew there, how it changed through the seasons, which flowers appeared first in spring and which came last in autumn. She told me about my grandfather in the way of someone who has been holding a version of someone for 3 years and is finally getting to give it to the person who deserves it. She said he used to bring her lemonade when she was picking in the summers when she was a girl, and that he had a way of sitting absolutely still on this porch that made the birds come closer than they would for anyone else. I told her about inheriting the house, about the specific, complicated feeling of receiving something large and beautiful that belonged to someone who was no longer there to tell you what to do with it. About not sitting on the porch, because sitting on the porch made the absence more present, which was something I hadn't said to anyone, and which arrived in the morning air between us, with the specific weight of a true thing said to someone who would understand it. She did understand it. She said, "I know. That's why I left the flowers. Not to make you feel his absence less, just to give the porch something to hold while you figured that out." I looked at this woman on my porch in the full morning light and understood that my grandfather had been right about the house and wrong about one thing. He said I'd never sit on the porch. He didn't know about the flowers. We have been together for 7 months. Wren teaches botany at the community college. She knows every plant in the field behind my house by its Latin name and its common name and its medicinal history and what month it will bloom. She has shown me things growing in that field that I walked past for 2 years without seeing, which is a metaphor I have been careful not to overuse, but which is also simply true. I sit on the porch every evening now, sometimes alone, sometimes with her, sometimes with coffee, and sometimes without. Mr. Calloway waves from his tomato plants at 7. The family's children play in the yard until the porch light comes on. The oak tree does what oak trees do with the afternoon light. Last month, Wren brought me the 12th flower, not on Tuesday or Thursday, on a Sunday in the afternoon. She walked across my porch and placed a small bunch of blue chicory on the railing post. The same flower as the first, the same twine. I said, "What's this for?" She said, "For the beginning." I said, "It's been 7 months." She said, "The beginning is still the beginning. That doesn't go away." I looked at the blue chicory on the railing post in the Sunday afternoon light, and I thought about a Tuesday morning in May, and a photograph on my phone, and a glass jar from a hardware store, and 18 seconds of porch camera footage that caught nothing useful except the fact that she was there. She was always there. I just hadn't been sitting on the porch. Last week, I asked her what my grandfather said about me, exactly. Not the porch line, the rest. What he said in the field on the summer afternoons when she was picking and he was sitting still enough for the birds to come close. She was quiet for a moment, the way she's quiet when she's choosing which true thing to say. And then she said, "He said you would come eventually, that you were someone who took the long way to things, but always arrived." I said, "He said that?" She said, "And he said when you got there, you'd be worth the wait." I sat on my grandfather's porch in the evening light with Wren beside me, and the mountains going purple in the distance, and the oak tree holding the last of the day, and I thought about a long way taken, and a right place arrived at, and a man who sat still enough on this porch for birds to come close, and I thought, yes, I'm here. I made it. She left the first flower on a Tuesday morning in May, without leaving a name. She left 42 flowers over 6 weeks before I was sitting on the porch early enough to find her. The porch was always there. I just needed someone to leave something on it worth coming outside for. She left wildflowers. She left herself. That was everything. I want to tell you about the glass jar. Not because it's important in the way that discoveries and revelations are important, but because it is the truest object in the story, and I think true objects deserve their own moment. When the third wildflower appeared, the purple clover, on a Thursday in the second week of May, I realized I had no way to keep it. My kitchen had no vase, no jar, nothing designed to hold cut stems. The first two bunches I had put in a glass of water, which worked but felt insufficient. Something about the care with which the flowers were left, the twine, the placement, the Tuesday-Thursday regularity that was already becoming a rhythm, made me feel that a drinking glass was the wrong container. So I went to the hardware store. I bought a wide-mouthed mason jar. Nothing expensive, $3 and change. I washed it, filled it with water, put the purple clover in it, and set it on the kitchen table. And then I stood back and looked at it and felt something I didn't immediately have a word for. What I felt was, this deserved to be taken seriously. Whatever this was, and I didn't know yet what this was, the person doing it had decided it was worth doing carefully, and careful things deserve careful reception. The jar accumulated. By the end of the first month, there were 7 jars on the kitchen table. I had added more as the flowers came, and the kitchen smelled like something I hadn't been able to name for a week before I realized it smelled like the field behind the house, which I had walked through twice in 2 years of living there. I started leaving the back door open in the mornings to let the same air in. My colleague Marcus asked me one day why I was suddenly in a better mood. I told him someone was leaving wildflowers on my porch. He said that was either very romantic or very unsettling. I said I had decided it was romantic. He said, "You've decided?" I said, "Yes. I think you get to decide how to read a thing like this." And I was reading it as someone paying attention to a house that hadn't been paid attention to, which made me want to pay attention to it too. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "You sound like someone who met someone." I said I hadn't met anyone. He said, "Yet." He is almost always right, and he is not gracious about it. The field behind the house became a thing I walked in. Not immediately, not until the 5th week, when the goldenrod appeared, and I looked it up and read that goldenrod was one of the last summer wildflowers in the southern Appalachians, and that its appearance meant the season was turning, and something in me responded to that with an urgency I didn't fully understand. I put on my boots and I went out the back gate and I walked into the field. It was fuller than I had imagined. I had seen the field from the back window and from the gate, but I had not been inside it, and being inside it was different from looking at it. It was approximately 2 acres of meadow that my grandfather had never cultivated, bordered by tree line on 3 sides, the mountains visible above the tree line to the west. The goldenrod was everywhere, tall and yellow, and doing the thing goldenrod does in the late afternoon light, which is to make the air around it look golden too. There were other things, the last of the Queen Anne's lace going to seed, some heel-all still blooming in the shadier patches near the trees, the beginning of what I would later learn was ironweed in the far corner. And there were footprints. Not many, the ground was dry, but in the soft earth near the tree line, where the shade kept the ground damp, there were the clear prints of someone who walked here often, smaller than mine, a particular path worn into the longer grass, visible when you knew to look for it, from the northwest corner where the fence had a gap to the center of the field where the wildflowers were thickest. I stood in the center of the field in the goldenrod light, and I understood. She had been coming here for 20 years, not just the 6 weeks of flowers, 20 years, since she was 8 years old. The path in the grass was not a new thing. It was worn into the meadow the way a path gets worn by use over decades, by someone who came here the way people go to places that belong to them before they can explain why. I walked the path to the northwest corner. I found the gap in the fence. I looked through it at the neighborhood beyond. The backs of houses, a street, and 2 streets over, barely visible, the roof of what might have been a house. I thought about an 8-year-old girl finding a gap in a fence and a field, and a man who sat still enough on his porch for birds to come close, who offered lemonade in the summers, who said the field grew better for the picking. I went back inside, and I texted my cousin Anya, who had known my grandfather well, and I said, "Did Grandpa ever mention a girl from the neighborhood who picked wildflowers in his field?" She called me back in 3 minutes. She said, "Oh, you mean Wren. I can't believe you don't know about Wren. He talked about her constantly." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said she was the most attentive person he'd ever met, that she knew every plant in that field by name and could tell you what month it would bloom and what soil it needed and what bird it attracted. He said she came to the field like it was a classroom and like he was the lucky one for having the classroom." I said, "Did he know her family?" She said, "He knew her mother. She grew up 2 streets over. Her mother was a botanist. She's a professor now, I think. The porch is full now. One more thing, because it belongs here. Last week I found something in the attic of the house. Not looking for it, just clearing boxes. A tin box that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside the tin, a small notebook, the kind with a marbled cover, and inside the notebook, pressed flat and dry between the pages, a series of wildflowers. 6 of them, each one labeled in his handwriting with the name and the date, and 1 or 2 words below each name. Blue chicory, May 1997. Yellow wood sorrel, May 1997. Purple clover, May 1997. The same flowers in the same order. He had been collecting them from the field every spring for years. Not every spring, I don't know how many, but the notebook was thick with them, pages pressed flat with specimens, and the earliest entry was 1994, and the most recent was the spring before he died. I sat on the attic floor with the notebook in my hands, and I understood. He knew which flowers bloomed when, and in what order, and he had been watching them bloom in that field for decades before Wren ever found it. He had known the field the way she knew the field. That was why he let her come. Not just generosity, recognition. The specific recognition of someone who found the same things worth finding and went about finding them with the same quality of attention. He had seen himself in an 8-year-old girl who came to pick wildflowers in a field, and he had let her come because he understood that the field was for people like her, which was also people like him. I showed the notebook to Wren. She held it carefully, the way she held the flowers, with the specific respect of someone who understands that things gathered from the ground are briefly borrowed and not truly owned. She turned the pages slowly. When she got to the most recent entry, May of 3 years ago, a few weeks before he died, she stopped. The flower was a small pressed sprig of blue chicory, and below it, in his handwriting, he had written, "First of the season. She'll be here by Thursday." She held the notebook for a long time without speaking. I said, "He was watching for you." She said, "He was always watching for me." I said, "He was watching for you to come back every spring." She said, "I always did." She said it simply, the way she said true things. And then she closed the notebook carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the attic window where the afternoon light was coming through at the specific angle of a May afternoon, which is the same angle it was 3 years ago when he pressed a sprig of blue chicory into a marbled notebook and wrote, "She'll be here by Thursday." She was here by Thursday. She came back every spring, and when the house was empty and the porch was unused and he was gone, she left the field come to the porch in his place, tied with twine, no name, twice a week, until the person in the house finally had the sense to sit outside early enough to find her. He said I was someone who took the long way to things but always arrived. He was right about both parts. I took the long way. 2 years in the house before I sat on the porch. 6 weeks of wildflowers before I set an alarm. 32 years before I understood that the right place to be in the morning was outside with coffee in the dark, watching the sky go from black to gray to the pale blue that comes before actual light. But I arrived. I'm here. She's here. The porch is full. The field is growing. The jar on the kitchen table has blue chicory in it. Always blue chicory, the first of the season, the one that comes back every May without being asked. He left her a note that said, "Leave something from the field." She left wildflowers. I left the back door open. Some things take the long way. They still arrive exactly on time. This morning, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. I don't set one anymore. I just wake. I made coffee and I went out to the porch and I sat in the dark in the specific May cold and I watched the sky go from black to the pale blue. The oak tree was doing what it does. Mr. Calloway's tomato plants were still. The street was empty. At 5:52, the gate unlatched. She came up the porch steps with heel-all in her hand, the tiny violet wildflower that grows in disturbed ground, the one from the 5th week. She put it on the railing post and she looked at me sitting there in the dark with my coffee, and she said, "You're always here now." I said, "I was always going to be here." She said, "You just needed something to come outside for." I said, "I needed the right thing on the railing." She sat down in the second chair. The morning arrived around us, and I thought about my grandfather sitting still on this porch in the evenings, still enough for the birds to come close, watching the path in the field, watching for whoever was going to come through the gap in the fence and find the field worth finding. He watched for 30 years. He just had to get the timing right. The twine was always twine. The flowers were always wildflowers. The porch was always this porch, waiting for someone to sit on it long enough to receive what the field was sending. She left the first one on a Tuesday morning in May without leaving a name. The name came later, on a Thursday at 5:30, when the morning was still dark and the wild bergamot was in her hand, and the porch had 2 chairs. It was always going to be 2 chairs. I just had to get the second one out. That's everything.